7th of 17 murders. On the evening of June 14, 1990, Smith was seen leaving the Phoenix Bar in Milwaukee, Wisconsin. He was last seen with Dahmer. After the drugging and strangulation, Smith's skeleton was kept in Dahmer's freezer for several months in the hopes that it would not retain moisture, as opposed to being promptly acidified or bleached, both of which had previously made the skulls of other victims brittle. Edward's skeleton was acidified months after freezing failed to remove moisture from it. The skull was accidentally destroyed by Dahmer when he dried it in the oven, which led to the explosion of the skull. Later, Dahmer told police he had felt terrible about murdering Smith since he couldn't retain any part of his body. Jeffrey Dahmer, the 8th of 17 murders. Ernest Miller and Jeffrey Dahmer met in front of a bookshop on North 27th Street. He was killed by having his throat slashed. His entire skeleton was found in Dahmer's apartment, and he later admitted to eating his biceps. Dahmer said, "I separated the joints, the arm joints, the leg joints, and had to do 2 boilings. I think I used 4 boxes of Soilex for each one, put in the upper portion of the body and boiled that for about 2 hours, and then the lower portion for another 2 hours. The Soilex removes all the flesh, turns it into a jelly-like substance, and it just rinses off. Then I laid the clean bones in a light bleach solution, left them there for a day and spread them out on either newspaper or cloth and let them dry for about a week in the bedroom." Dahmer disturbingly kept his biceps in the freezer, painted his skull, and also bleached his skeleton. Jeffrey Dahmer, the 9th of 17 murders. On September 24, 3 weeks after Miller's murder, Dahmer ran into David Thomas at the Grand Avenue Mall. Dahmer offered him money if he would pose for pictures and encouraged him to pay a visit to his flat for a few drinks. It's believed that he went with him back to Dahmer's home in West Allis, Wisconsin. Thomas was beaten, strangled, and mutilated. Photographs of his dismembered body were discovered. He captured images of the dismemberment procedure and kept them, which helped Thomas be recognized. However, his actual remains were never found. Jeffrey Dahmer, the 10th of 17 murders. Curtis Straughter was just 17 years old when he encountered serial killer Jeffrey Dahmer. Unbeknown to the teenager, on February 18, 1991, Curtis was waiting at a bus stop outside Marquette University, when he was approached by Dahmer. At this time, unbeknown to Straughter, Dahmer had murdered 9 boys and men and dismembered their bodies. Straughter was allegedly lured to Dahmer's apartment on the pretense of money in exchange for posing for photographs. Once arriving at Dahmer's apartment, Straughter was drugged, restrained, and murdered. Dahmer then dismembered his body, while capturing each step on camera. Once he had photographed his victim's body, Dahmer kept the Polaroid pictures in his bedside table as a chilling memento. Straughter was Dahmer's 10th victim. Jeffrey Dahmer, the 11th of 17 murders. On April 7, 1991, Dahmer met Errol Lindsey and lured him back to his apartment. It was there he drugged Errol and kept alive to perform a gruesome experiment. Dahmer drilled a hole in his head and poured hydrochloric acid into it, hoping to render the victim in a vegetative state. He then murdered the 19-year-old. Later, he decapitated Errol, and Dahmer had oral sex with the corpse before dismembering it. He kept the skull as a trophy and disposed of some of his body. Jeffrey Dahmer, the 12th of 17 murders. Anthony Hughes met serial killer Jeffrey Dahmer at a Milwaukee gay bar in May 1991. Dahmer was a regular and had previously lured his victims with the promise of sex and sexual favors. According to sources, Hughes, then 31, agreed to go home with Dahmer. Once inside, Dahmer drugged him and then strangled him to death. Dahmer dismembered his body and dissolved it in acid. He also kept his skull as a souvenir. Jeffrey Dahmer, the 13th of 17 murders. Dahmer had lured Konarak Sinthasampon, 14 years old, to his apartment for a few drinks by offering to pay him money in exchange for photographs. The serial killer even went as far as drilling a hole into the victim's skull, which he filled with hydrochloric acid. The teen was naked, bruised, bleeding and heavily under the influence of drugs when he managed to escape. Sandra Smith, Tina Spivey and Nicole Childress discovered the teen and called police, but ultimately the cops handed Konarak back to Dahmer after being convinced he was his 19-year-old lover. Dahmer strangled him to death, dismembered his victim's body, dissolved the flesh in acid, pulverized the bones, and disposed of the remains. However, Konarak's head was kept in the freezer, and cops reportedly found his skull after Jeffrey's arrest. Jeffrey Dahmer, the 14th of 17 murders. In 1991, Dahmer traveled to Chicago to attend a gay pride parade. It was there he met Turner, who was waiting at a bus station. Dahmer lured the young man back to Milwaukee, Wisconsin, and invited him into his apartment. It was there he drugged, strangled, and dismembered Turner's body. The body had been dissected and scattered all around his apartment. Dahmer then preserved some of Turner's body parts in his freezer. His torso was placed in the freezer first, followed by his head and internal organs. Jeffrey Dahmer, the 15th of 17 murders. Just days after Dahmer killed 20-year-old Matthew Turner, he met Weinberger in Chicago. The two then took a Greyhound bus to Milwaukee to spend the weekend together. However, Weinberger's weekend getaway quickly went south, after Dahmer drugged him, and injected boiling water through his skull. The injection put Weinberger into a coma. He died 2 days later. Jeffrey Dahmer, the 16th of 17 murders. Oliver Lacey moved to Milwaukee from Chicago. Dahmer introduced himself to Lacey as a professional photographer and quickly charmed the aspiring bodybuilder. Lacey then went back to Dahmer's home for a photo shoot. Lacey was drugged and strangled with a leather strap. Dahmer had sex with the corpse before dismembering and decapitating him. Dahmer put his head and heart in the refrigerator. His skeleton was retained to adorn one side of the private shrine of skulls and skeletons Dahmer was in the process of creating when arrested 1 week later. Jeffrey Dahmer, the 17th of 17 murders. Joseph Breithaupt met the serial killer at a bus stop in Milwaukee on July 19, 1991. Dahmer lured the 25-year-old back to his apartment by offering him $50 to pose nude. Whilst in the serial killer's apartment, Breithaupt was drugged and strangled to death. Dahmer dismembered him and kept his skull and torso in his apartment as gruesome souvenirs of the evil crime. The victim's body parts were found in Dahmer's freezer only 3 days later, when the killer was finally caught by the police. Daniel Camargo Barbosa was a serial killer and a child and woman murderer, believed to have possibly raped and killed over 150 victims, primarily targeting female children, as they were more likely to be virgins. He confessed to killing 72 victims. He strangled young girls in Colombia and was arrested, but he escaped from prison, and started killing in Ecuador. From 1984 to 1986, Camargo committed a series of at least 54 rapes and murders in Guayaquil. He was rearrested in 1986. Camargo was killed in jail by the nephew of one of his victims. Good. Surinder Kohli and Moninder Singh Pandher. Between 2005 and 2006, a domestic servant of Indian businessman, Moninder Singh Pandher, Surinder Kohli, kidnapped, raped, murdered, and dismembered 19 people, mostly children. Kohli, under the alias Satish, later confessed to killing 6 children and a 20-year-old woman referred to as Pyle after sexually assaulting them. The police said that there were at least 31 child victims. Kohli also had confessed to the consumption of the victims' livers and other body parts. It was alleged that Kohli would lure the children to the house, offering them sweets and chocolates, murder them and have sex with the corpses. He and his co-accused Moninder Singh Pander was convicted and sentenced to life. Jack Owen Spillman, the Werewolf Butcher. Spillman was convicted of the April 1995 murders of Rita Huffman, 48, and her daughter Mandy, 15, and the 1994 murder of Penny Davis, 9. Huffman and her daughter were both found in their East Wenatchee, Washington home, sexually mutilated and posed in provocative positions. Spillman's pickup was stopped by an East Wenatchee police officer in the parking lot of a VFW hall nearby that evening, and subsequently, a 12-inch knife covered in blood was recovered there. It appeared to match a knife set in the victim's house. Spillman pleaded guilty to 3 counts of first-degree murder, and was sentenced to life in prison in 1996. He is serving his sentence at Washington State Penitentiary. The New York Zodiac is an American serial killer who struck New York City from 1990 to 1993. Before being caught on June 18, 1996, Seda killed 3 people and wounded 6 others, 4 critically. Seda is believed to have admired the Zodiac killer for avoiding capture. He was a recluse obsessed with astrology and death. Seda was formally charged in the case on June 21, 1996, convicted in 1998, and sentenced to 232 years imprisonment. Seda shot people throughout New York City, sending taunting messages to the police after each crime. The killer's letters to police claimed that he was selecting his victims based on their signs of the zodiac, and implied he would act only at certain times when specific stars were visible in the night sky. The shotgun stalker, James Swan, is an American serial killer whose random drive-by shotgun shootings in Washington, D.C. in 1993 earned him his nickname in the press. Swan drove to Washington to carry out the attacks, which took place in the Mount Pleasant and Columbia Heights neighborhoods. Each of the attacks followed a standard format. Swan would slow his car down next to a pedestrian and fire a 20-gauge shotgun at the target before driving away. Swan killed 4 people and injured 5 in 14 attacks before he was apprehended by the Metropolitan Police on April 19, 1993. Swan was found not guilty by reason of insanity and confined to St. Elizabeth's Hospital. He claimed to have been driven to the killings by voices in his head. Robert Black was a Scottish serial killer who was convicted of the kidnap, rape and murder of 4 girls aged between 5 and 11 in a series of killings committed between 1981 and 1986 in the United Kingdom, the rape and murder of 3 girls on May 19, 1994 and the kidnapping of a 4th girl, and had earlier been convicted of the kidnapping and sexual assault of a 5th. He was sentenced to life imprisonment. He was convicted of the 1981 sexual assault and murder of 9-year-old Jennifer Cardy in 2011, and was regarded as the prime suspect in the 1978 disappearance and murder of 13-year-old Janet Tate. Black may also have been responsible for several other unsolved child murders throughout Britain, Ireland, and continental Europe between 1969 and 1987. He died of a heart attack in 2016 aged 68. Ricky Lee Green was an American serial killer who murdered at least 4 people in Texas between 1985 and 1986. On March 27, 1985, he killed 16-year-old Jeffrey Davis. His nearly decapitated, mutilated, and castrated body was found the next April in a swamp near the Fort Worth Nature Center and Refuge. On October 12, 1985, Green picked up 28-year-old Betty Jo Monroe, and then drove to the Greens' mobile home in Boyd. There, she was sexually assaulted, stabbed 17 times, struck with a hammer, and one of her breasts was mutilated. Green left the woman's body in a rural area in Flatwood. On November 23, Green met 27-year-old Sandra Lorraine Bailey at a club in Fort Worth. Bailey was sexually assaulted at Green's Fort Worth home, stabbed 30 times and bludgeoned with a hammer. Gerald Parker is an American serial killer who raped and murdered 5 women in Orange County, California in 1978 and 1979. On July 19, 1979, he entered the apartment of Jane P. through an open window. He grabbed a piece of wood, hit her over the head several times, and raped her. On February 2, 1980, Ada Demi Ryan was locking her car in the underground parking garage when Parker struck her numerous times with a metal pipe. He dragged her several feet, took off her necklace, looked through her purse, and lifted up her skirt. A witness across the street observed Parker standing over Demi Ryan and yelled at him to stop. Parker ran off. 2 weeks later, 13-year-old Paula S. was walking home from a drugstore in Tustin. He raped her and later admitted to police that if she had been older he would have killed her.
Did you at any time ever use an ice pick?
No, sir.
You struck Miss Lamp with a sledgehammer. You recall the sledgehammer which was introduced?
Yes, sir, I recall.
Was that true?
No, sir.
Lawrence Whitaker, with an IQ of 138, dragged high school girls into his van, then murdered them by twisting a coat hanger around their throat with a pair of pliers. When his tape recording of one murder was played in court, people rushed outside and vomited.
They touched Miss Ledford on the breast with cold metal pliers. If you listen to the tape, you'll hear those pliers being replaced in a toolbox a few seconds later.
Oh, what did you touch her on the breast for with a pair of pliers?
To shock her with the cold metal.
Since I have been in Dade County, I've been allowed to...
Shake your finger at me, young man. Don't shake your finger at me, young man.
But Bundy couldn't stop the testimony of 3 co-eds who miraculously survived his brutal fury.
My teeth were knocked out. I had broken facial bones. I had a broken arm and a crushed finger.
Her jawbone was held together by a metal pin.
I had 5 skull fractures and multiple contusions in my head. And because of the skull fractures, the 8th nerve was damaged and I lost the hearing in my left ear and the equilibrium. And I had a broken jaw and my left shoulder was pulled out of joint.
Mr. Bundy? Yes.
Would you point him out then for the court? Objection. I would like to point him out for the purpose of the motion.
David Berkowitz, 24, called himself the Son of Sam. He believed a neighbor's barking dog was the devil's voice ordering him to purify the world. During 1977 in New York City, he killed teenage lovers in parked cars. When arrested, he said, "People say he's smiling, so he must be happy he killed them. I wasn't happy. I just had a job to do, and was doing it."
The last call killer, Richard Rogers, is an American serial killer who murdered and dismembered at least 2 gay and bisexual men between 1992 and 1993. His modus operandi consisted of luring inebriated men from piano bars in Manhattan, murdering and dismembering them, and dumping their bodies in garbage bags along highways in New Jersey. He is suspected of murdering several other men in Maine, Florida, Connecticut, Pennsylvania, and New York from the 1970s to the 1990s. Rogers wasn't arrested until 2001, when a new forensic technique was used to uncover his fingerprints from the bags he used to wrap his victims' body parts in. Rogers was later convicted of 2 counts of first-degree murder and 2 counts of hindering apprehension. He is now serving 2 consecutive life sentences in New Jersey State Prison and has never spoken about the murders.
So it was self-defense.
Yeah. Bitter, evil, angry, have never been before in my life. Worse than even out there with those men. This is evil. I never hated men, but now I do. I mean, not all. I have a category. I hate those male... I hate those male cops. Real bad. Because they're dirtballs.
I sentence you in case number 91-463 to death for the murder of Troy Burris.
Thank you. And probably see, I'll be up in heaven while y'all are rotting in hell. May your wife and kids get raped.
I would ask that you would
Right. I know I was raped, and you aren't nothing but a bunch of skunk.
Therefore, these proceedings are now
Putting
concluded.
somebody who was raped to death.
Countess Bathory. Elizabeth Bathory and 4 of her servants were accused of torturing and killing hundreds of girls and women between 1590 and 1610. Her servants were put on trial and convicted, whereas Bathory was confined to her home. She was imprisoned within Castle of Ksechty. The charges leveled against Bathory have been described by several historians as a witch hunt. Other writers have said that the accusations against Bathory were supported by testimony from more than 300 individuals, some of whom described physical evidence and the presence of mutilated dead, dying and imprisoned girls found at the time of her arrest. Legends describing her vampiric tendencies, such as the tale that she bathed in the blood of virgins to retain her youth, were generally recorded years after her death, and are considered unreliable. Hans Schmidt was a German Catholic priest, rapist, convicted murderer, and suspected serial killer. He was executed at Sing Sing prison in New York for murdering a woman in the United States. Schmidt remains the only Catholic priest in American history to face capital punishment. Hans was regularly beaten by his father and watched his father beating his mother. Even in childhood, Schmidt combined a deep religious devotion with bisexual promiscuity and a fascination with drinking blood and dismembering animals. Hans once beheaded 2 of his parents' geese and kept the severed heads in his pocket. He also frequented the village slaughterhouse daily, where he would watch the death and dissection of farm animals. Walter Earl Ellis, known as the Milwaukee North Side Strangler, was an American serial killer who raped and strangled at least 9 women in the city of Milwaukee, Wisconsin between 1986 and 2007. Until May 2009, the killings were considered to be independent of one another, but were then linked together via DNA profiling. Ellis would be arrested as a suspect on September 7, 2009, and convicted for the 7 murders in February 2011, receiving 7 consecutive life sentences without the chance of parole. The North Side Strangler victims were black women who ranged in age from 19 to 41. John Justin Bunting is an Australian serial killer who was the ringleader in the Snowtown murders. The Snowtown murders were a series of murders committed by John Bunting, Robert Wagner, and James V. Lasakis between August 1992 and May 1999, in South Australia. On May 20, 1999, the remains of 8 victims were found by the South Australian police in 6 plastic barrels in an unused bank vault. A piece of the flesh of the 11th and final victim, David Johnson, was fried and eaten by Bunting and Wagner. Robert Joe Wagner and Bunting, sentenced to 11 consecutive life sentences without the possibility of parole. During his crimes as a serial killer, he was known to commit acts of cannibalism, torture, strangle and murder his victims. The Forest Park Killer, Todd Allen Reed, is an American serial killer and sex offender who raped and strangled 3 homeless women in Portland, Oregon between April and June 1999, later dumping their bodies in the Forest Park Reserve. Lilla Moeller, 28, was the first to be found on May 7, 1999, followed the next day by Stephanie Russell, 26, whose body was located only 80 yards from where Moeller was found. The third grisly discovery was the corpse of Tamara Eisen, 17, found on June 2nd. All 3 women were prostitutes and drug addicts, were found nude and strangled, and bore a striking resemblance to one another. Reed pleaded guilty to all 3 slayings February of 2001 and was sentenced to life in prison with no parole. The convicted serial murderer is also a suspect in several other slayings. American Jack the Ripper. In April 1982, William Dean Christensen abducted 27-year-old Sylvie Trudel in Montreal. He brought her to an empty apartment where he raped, beat, and strangled her to death. He decapitated and dismembered her body with a hacksaw. That same month, Christensen strangled 26-year-old Muriel Gay, again dismembering the body afterwards. Both of their remains were discovered on April 27. On September 23, 1982, Christensen picked up 23-year-old Michelle Angiers in Scranton, Pennsylvania, and drove her to Dixon City, where he raped and stabbed her 30 times, killing her. On December 4, 1983, Christensen shot and killed 51-year-old Joseph Connolly outside a bar after an argument. Christensen was located a few hours later and arrested. Larry Dwayne Hall is an American murderer, rapist and serial killer who stalked and murdered numerous girls and women between 1981 and 1994. Hall traveled around the Midwest where he would often abduct, rape, torture, and murder girls and women. It is believed that Hall's first murder occurred when he was 18. 15-year-old Dean Marie Pyle Peters disappeared from her Grand Rapids, Michigan middle school in February 1981, and her body was never recovered. 12-year-old Deborah Jean Cole disappeared from her Indiana hometown in late August, which Hall is also suspected of. Over the next 13 years, numerous female corpses, some as young as 10 and some unidentified, were discovered and later attributed to Hall due to their bodies being strangled and sexually mutilated. His final assumed killing took place in early October 1994. The London chambermaid slayer, Gerald Thomas Archer, was a Canadian serial killer who was active in and around his hometown of London, Ontario from January 1969 to January 1971. All three of his confirmed victims were female hotel employees. Jane Woolley, 62, was beaten and stabbed to death in her York Street, London apartment on January 31, 1969. Edith Outbier, 57, was beaten and stabbed to death in her William Street, Merlin home on September 4, 1970. Her body was discovered the next day by her neighbor Mary Gray. Belva Russell, 57, was beaten to death in her Adelaide Street, South Chatham apartment on January 23, 1971. Her body was discovered minutes after her death. The Cape Cod Vampire. Tony Costa was convicted of brutally murdering and dismembering Patricia Walsh and Mary Ann Wysocki in 1969, but he's suspected of killing as many as 8 women over a 3-year period. Costa was living in a boarding house at the time of the murders, and gave off an impression of being a little bit off. He was known to have made a hobby out of taxidermy. In 1969, police in Truro, Massachusetts unearthed the bodies of 4 women who had been mutilated almost beyond recognition. They were the victims of Tony Costa, who soon became known as the Cape Cod Vampire. On May 12, 1974, Costa committed suicide by hanging himself in his prison cell. Robert Liberty met Marcella Landis in 1966. On June 4, 1966, Liberty strangled Landis to death with a silk stocking. He dressed up the corpse and applied makeup to it before laying it on a couch and lit candles from her head to her feet, and placing a Bible on her chest. On March 12, 1970, Liberty fatally shot one of his roommates, 25-year-old Thomas Astorina. Liberty, now on the run, befriended Kenal Beerley. On June 6, Liberty and Beerley were hitchhiking in Long Beach. They were picked up by 17-year-old Richard Krytok. They broke into the apartment of 53-year-old Robert J. Irion. At midnight, Liberty killed Irion by fatally beating him to death. He displayed the body on the bedroom floor and lit candles on the head. He then wrote on the bedroom door, "The candlelight killer strikes again, and catch me if you can." Cleophas Prince Jr. is an American serial killer who murdered 6 women in San Diego County, California, from January through September 1990. Prince entered the female victim's residence during daylight hours through an unlocked door or window, during or just after they bathed, and stabbed them to death with knives taken from their kitchen. In January, Tiffany Schultz was stabbed to death, and in April, Janine Weinhold met the same fate. Later in April, Holly Tarr from Michigan, who was visiting her brother at his apartment, was killed. Prince's next and last kills were the murders of Pamela and Amber Clark in University City. The mother and daughter were killed in their home in September of 1990. Prince was arrested and eventually found guilty of all 6 murders on July 13, 1993. Sentenced to death, he awaits his fate on San Quentin's death row.
Was there something sexual in the dismemberment of the bodies for you?
As time went on, yes, I did get there was a sexual part to that. I started saving the skeletons and preserving other parts, and one thing led to another. It took more and more deviant type behaviors to satisfy my urges, and so it just spiraled out of control.
Why the cannibalism?
That was another step. It made me feel like they were a permanent part of me.
I will accept these pleas of guilty, and adjudge you Dennis L. Rader guilty of murder in the first degree in count 1, a Class A felony, murder in the first degree in count 2, a Class A felony, murder in the first degree in count 3, a Class A felony, murder in the first degree in count 4, a Class A felony, murder in the first degree in count 5, a Class A felony, murder in the first degree in count 6, a Class A felony, murder in the first degree in count 7, a Class A felony, murder in the first degree in count 8, a Class A felony, murder in the first degree in count 9, a Class A felony, and murder in the first degree in count 10, a Class A felony.
You took the lives of 48 women. You snuffed them out. More than 48 women.
71, yes.
Right. You killed them all, Ridgway. You killed them all.
Mm-hmm.
And you did things to those women before you strangled them.
I had sex with them, that's all.
It would be important for us to know, but you chose not to share that information.
Because there is nothing to share.
I believe there is. You're lying again.
No, the thing that I did to them was, the major thing was when I dropped them is when they died slow. I could count to 60 and they're dead. They died slow because I was choking them.
Can you tell me why you cut off the breasts of one victim?
To do something different. I mean, she was already dead. I mean, it wasn't something that she was alive. And I wanted to create a sensationalism.
But I mean, you still have to have the balls to do this. I mean...
It's not hard. It's just a body. I mean, it's not a living person no more.
How did you feel when you committed the crimes?
No feeling.
No feeling whatsoever?
No.
Nothing?
Nothing. I forgot, like it didn't happen. I could put myself into a zone to do something like that. And it would be like remote control.
Serial killers like to strangle their victims, and that is, I guess, the most common form of killing, because there's more of a connection there, it's more real, and it's not as quick. It was 3:30 in the afternoon on a fairly well-driven road. She was walking along the side of the road, and I just stopped the car, got out of the car, and went, raped her, and killed her.
He waited till he got about to this spot when there was no cars coming, and he grabbed her and pulled her into the woods. Somewhere between the edge of the road and this spot here, he administered a beating to her, and then he made her take her clothes off, and he raped her and strangled her in that area right over there.
In the late 1980s, convicted child kidnapper Andre Rand brought the urban legend of Cropsey to life. Cropsey was a mythical boogeyman-type character feared by the children of Staten Island. Cropsey was described as an escaped mental patient with a hook for a hand who would kidnap young children and drag them back to an abandoned asylum at night. Although the story was considered an urban legend meant to keep children from misbehaving, some consider Rand to be the real Cropsey. Andre Rand wasn't an escaped mental patient, but he did once work at Willowbrook State School, the Staten Island facility that the Cropsey legend centered around. Rand is responsible for the kidnapping of at least 2 young girls in the 1980s and is believed by many to have also murdered them, along with several other children. This man, who emerged seemingly from myth, outraged the close-knit community with his crimes and will forever merge with legend as a cautionary tale. The Osmington shooting was a familicide in Osmington, Western Australia on May 11, 2018, in which Peter Miles, a 61-year-old retired high school farm manager, shot dead his wife, daughter, and 4 grandchildren, before calling police and then committing suicide. It is the worst shooting incident in Australia since the Port Arthur massacre of 1996. Peter first shot Katrina and her 4 children while they slept in their beds, before shooting his wife Zindat, in the living room of their home. He then placed a 2-minute 000 call to police alerting them to the shootings before committing suicide. A suicide note was also confirmed to have been found. Peter was also found to be on SSRI class antidepressants at the time of the incident. The Stockwell Strangler. Kenneth Erskine is a British serial killer who became known as the Stockwell Strangler. He committed the murders of between 7 and 11 senior citizens in London between April and July 1986. Several of them had been sexually abused, with no signs of forced entry apparent at any of the crime scenes. A large-scale investigation took place to discover the depraved murderer that was targeting pensioners in Lambeth and Stockwell, often stealing their cash after strangling them to death with his bare hands. The cul-de-sac killer, Stephen Akinmurel, was a suspected serial killer who was charged with murdering 5 elderly people between 1995 and 1998 and was accused of killing at least 2 other people. He confessed to several murders but committed suicide before his trial. He had a history of mental illness and had carried out crimes against the elderly from the age of 11. Akinmurel's suicide note in August 1999, he admitted to the crimes, saying that he regretted them and feared he would kill again. Detective Superintendent Bob Denmark of Lancashire Police said Akinmurel was a very dangerous and disturbed young man. I've interviewed him personally and regard him as one of the most dangerous men I have ever met. I would always have been concerned about his propensity to kill. Herbert Richard Baumeister. In the late 80s and 90s, Herbert Baumeister would lure gay men back to his pool house, then strangle them with a hose, burn the bodies, and dump them in the woods behind his home. Baumeister had his pool area decorated with mannequins that were set up to seem like they were having a pool party. A resident of the Indianapolis suburb of Westfield, Indiana, Baumeister was under investigation for murdering over a dozen men, most of whom were last seen at gay bars. Police found the remains of 11 men, 8 identified, on Baumeister's property. Baumeister shot himself in the head after a warrant was issued for his arrest. He was later linked to a series of murders of at least 12 men along Interstate 70. Mr. Cruel. In the late 1980s and early 1990s, Mr. Cruel, as dubbed by media, has clocked up 3 confirmed attacks and is the prime suspect in the abduction and murder of a 4th girl, 13-year-old Chinese-Australian Carmaine Chan. Chan was taken from her home in Templestowe at night point in 1991 and her body was found a year later in a landfill area in Thomastown with 3 bullet holes in the back of her skull. Mr. Cruel's attacks have chilling similarities. He monitored and observed the victim and their family prior to the attack. He covered his face with a balaclava at all times. He was soft-spoken and unhurried. He bound and gagged the parents and siblings of his victims. He demanded and searched for money. He demanded his victims brush their teeth. And he used a neck brace to tie his victims to a bed following each abduction. Stuart Wilkin, an African serial killer, cannibal and necrophile, having killed individuals from two distinct victim types, female prostitutes and young boys. Wilkins raped and murdered 10 victims between 1990 and 1997 in Port Elizabeth, on the east coast of South Africa. Wilkins committed acts of cannibalism and necrophilia during his crimes. Wilkins was reported to have cut off and ate a nipple of one of his victims. One of his victims was his own daughter, who disappeared in 1995. Her body was found in 1996 wrapped in a tarpaulin behind a Holiday Inn garden court in South Africa. Stuart Wilkin was sentenced to 7 terms of life imprisonment on February 23, 1998.
And what were you doing while you were strangling? Were you looking at them?
Some I were, some I wasn't, some I was holding down, some I was looking out the window. Some I was just staring off into space.
34-year-old Joel Rifkin is a self-confessed serial killer on New York's Long Island. He may have murdered as many as 17 prostitutes.
Rifkin's crimes come to light in June 1993, when he is apprehended by New York State troopers patrolling Long Island's Southern State Parkway.
Calculating, very intentional. He knew very well that it was wrong, and he took extraordinary steps to prevent himself from being caught.
The jury needs just 2.5 hours to reach a verdict.
As to count 1, murder in the second degree, what is your verdict?
Guilty.
Rifkin is given the maximum sentence of 25 years to life.
Trevor Joseph Hardy is a convicted British serial killer who murdered 3 teenage girls between December 1974 and March 1976. In 1977, he was found guilty and was sentenced to life imprisonment. Janet Leslie Stewart, 15, was stabbed to death on New Year's Eve 1974 and buried in a shallow grave in North Manchester. Wanda Scala, 17, was murdered in July 1975 on Lightbone Road, Miston, while walking home from the hotel where she worked. She had been hit over the head with a brick and sexually assaulted. Her body was found partially buried on a construction site. In March 1976, after walking home from a staff party, Sharon Mossoff was stabbed and strangled with a pair of tights prior to being dumped in the Rochdale Canal at Failsworth, Oldham. The bodies of Scala and Mossoff were found stripped and mutilated. Scott Lee Kimball is a convicted serial killer who murdered at least 4 people over a 2-year period. Investigators strongly suspect him in as many as 21 other unsolved killings. 2 of Kimball's victims were people close to him, the daughter of his 3rd wife, and his own uncle. His 2nd wife, who bore his 2 sons, claims he twice kidnapped and raped her. There was an open arrest warrant for him from the 2nd assault, which occurred after he absconded from work release. He also allegedly attempted to kill his son, but no charges were filed in the incident due to legal complications. The body of his 2nd victim, Jennifer Markham, has not been found. After being sentenced in 2008 to 53 years in prison on theft and a number of other charges, Kimball was sentenced on Thursday, October 8, 2009, to an additional 70 years in prison for his guilty pleas to 2nd-degree murder.